Good evening and welcome to Poland Daily. I'm Konrad Gorlinski and this is the news. Well, the situation on the Polish-Belarusian border unfortunately remains tense. There was a serious incident near Terespol last night as lighting masts set up by soldiers of the Polish army on the border with Belarus were shot up. In the last 24 hours, there have been 102 attempts to illegally cross the Polish-Belarusian border. The lighting that was set up by the army to illuminate the border strip was shot up and destroyed. Most likely, a pneumatic weapon was used for this, as loud shots were not heard. The persons who fired at these searchlights must have fired at them from various positions, and so we were dealing with deliberate actions, with shots from a number of set locations. In Michałów, Belarusian soldiers were seen destroying the temporary fencing installed by the Poles. In the forest, just a few yards away, several dozen migrants were waiting for them to lead them across. The border was also breached in Mielnik. It began when a fence was thrown over the concertina. Nobody got across it, nor did anyone try. But 2 kilometers away, about an hour later, the concertina there was cut open, and some persons immediately entered Polish territory while blinding our officers with lasers. It was a group of 29 Iraqis. Deputy Minister Błażej Poboży has announced that journalists, on the basis of accreditations granted by the border guard, will now have access to the border area to perform their professional activities. A press center will also be built in the vicinity. We will try to include representatives of television, radio, internet media, and press agencies in one visiting team, and such a group, under the control and care of the border guard and other formations supporting it, will now be able to visit the area. Meanwhile, Alexander Lukashenko is launching blackmail tactics. He's threatened to cut off the transit of gas into Poland in the event of a closure of the Polish-Belarusian border. Lukashenko, for some time now, has not been the owner of the pipelines through which gas and oil are transported from Russia to Poland. So he would in this case have to infringe on property rights. The ambassadors of the member states of the European Union adopted sanctions against Belarus, which cover about 30 people and entities responsible for the migration crisis. The restrictions include prohibition of entry into the European Union and the freezing of assets. Sanctions are an effective weapon, as long as Lukashenko does not feel that it is no longer in his interest to pursue this. The whole procedure will probably continue, so it's important to take appropriate countermeasures now. Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs Paweł Jabłoński noted that it was the Polish diplomatic offensive that contributed to the imposition of further sanctions on the Lukashenko regime. Due to the fact that from the very beginning, when this problem began to appear in June and July, we started to prepare for this attack and created security measures at the border. Thanks to this diplomatic and political work, the vast majority of European politicians admit that what Poland is doing is right. On Tuesday, President Andrzej Duda signed an amendment to the Act on the Protection of the State Border. It provides for a ban on staying in the border area and includes around 183 localities. The amendment also allows border guards to use disabling chemical agents. The regulation prohibits carrying and transporting any type of weapon, even in an unloaded state. And tensions between Kiev and Moscow are escalating in the wake of concerns by the West about a possible invasion of Ukraine. Meanwhile, Russia accuses Ukraine of escalating the conflict by deploying half of its army near the Donbas. NATO has declared that it will react in the event of any Russian aggression. Tens of thousands of Russian soldiers began regular exercises in Crimea and in the Volgograd Oblast, i.e. in the vicinity of the conflict-torn Donbas. In response to these actions, Ukraine also gathered troops in the east of the country. According to the president of Russia, it's not his country that's escalating the tension. It's the West that, contrary to agreements, is moving NATO's infrastructure further east. I'm talking to the United States and its allies. We insist on reaching an agreement that will prevent any expansion of NATO eastwards and the deployment of threatening weapons systems close to our borders. Ukrainian intelligence data show that almost 100,000 Russian soldiers were gathered at its eastern border, along with artillery and armored forces. President Volodymyr Zelensky has announced that his countrymen will fight for their lands using all their abilities. We must admit that without our troops, we will not be able to stop the war. We will not be able to avoid a war without direct negotiations with Russia. I'm not afraid of a direct conversation with Putin. We are not afraid of direct dialogue. We know which European countries support Ukraine, and we are grateful to them. Yesterday, NATO foreign ministers visited Riga for a two-day meeting. The most important topic of conversation was the concentration of Russian troops on the border with Ukraine.
Russia has no veto, Russia has no say, and Russia has no right to establish a sphere of influence trying to control their neighbors.
Kiev is calling inter alia for the introduction of a deterrent package in the form of sanctions against Russia. At the summit in the Latvian capital, possible scenarios of reactions to possible aggression against Ukraine are to be discussed.
Everything has to be done in order to make clear that any aggression against Ukraine will have a strong response. And that's what we are going to talk today here also.
Polish Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs Paweł Jabłoński points out that some countries disregard or have delayed reactions to aggressive actions by Russia. It can, in order to achieve its political goals in domestic politics and foreign policy. Vladimir Putin's Russia is capable of violating international law, of aggressive actions, and criminal actions, really. The former head of the Foreign Intelligence Agency, Colonel Grzegorz Małecki, believes that in the current actions of Russia, there's an attempt to probe the U.S. Russia is trying to discourage actions which it sees as harmful. For example, the admission of Ukraine into NATO, or forcing certain actions that concern, for example, the activation of Nord Stream 2. The boldness of Russia's actions may be due to the West's passivity in the matter, and especially of Washington, says journalist Tomasz Grzwaczewski. They can, even rightly, be convinced that the West is incapable right now of reacting to even the most brutal acts of the use of force, including aggression against Ukraine. NATO diplomats admit that the alliance is not sure what the Kremlin is actually planning, but that NATO foreign ministers are to discuss contingency plans just in case. NATO wants to warn Russia about the high costs of any aggression against Ukraine, but at the same time, not to provoke Moscow to take more aggressive steps. It will be a big day tomorrow for Hong Kong's pro-democracy activists. Activist Chow Hang Tung will appear in court tomorrow as she faces charges of inciting participation in this year's banned annual June 4th vigil to commemorate victims of China's 1989 crackdown on pro-democracy protesters in and around Beijing's Tiananmen Square. Chow, the vice chairwoman of the since disbanded Hong Kong Alliance in support of patriotic democratic movements in China, the organizer of the annual vigils, was arrested the day before the anniversary and remained in police detention throughout June 4th.
It's actually a weapon of mass destruction for Hong Kong, I would say. The government always criticizes us, the activists, the pro-democracy camp, for destabilizing Hong Kong. I think it's the government, it's the national security law that's destabilizing Hong Kong. It's destroying the environment of stability, of security that people have been living in. It's scaring people away from Hong Kong, scaring investment, even and economic development, all that.
The alliance dissolved earlier this year amid a national security investigation, with police accusing the group of being an agent of foreign forces, which the group had denied. The former British colony, which returned to Chinese rule in 1997 with the promise of wide-ranging freedoms, traditionally holds the largest June 4th vigil in the world. The last two vigils were banned by police, citing coronavirus restrictions on public gatherings. But coming after the mass pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong in 2019, the bars were seen by many activists as an attempt to shut down any display of defiance to Beijing. Hong Kong authorities denied that was the reason. Chow also separately faces charges of inciting subversion under the security law imposed by Beijing in June 2020 to end the protests and set the global financial hub firmly on an authoritarian path. And finally, Britain's Prince Charles attended a reception at State House in the capital of Barbados yesterday, after a ceremony to mark the country's transition to a republic. The new Republic of Barbados has decided to part ways with the Queen and the Commonwealth. Charles was also seen attending an event for his charity, the Prince's Trust, before visiting Barbados's National Archives. Barbados inaugurated President Sandra Mason as its head of state on Tuesday to replace Britain's Queen Elizabeth in a ceremony attended by Charles, marking a cordial severing of ties to the monarchy.
Your Royal Highness, that we were truly touched by your ability to join us for this very special occasion. And we're very grateful for your presence, for your words, and for your continued friendship and commitment to our nation.
The birth of the Republic, 55 years to the day since Barbados declared independence, unclasps almost all the colonial bonds that have kept this tiny island tied to England, since an English ship claimed it for King James I in 1625. It may also be a harbinger of a broader attempt by other former colonies to cut ties to the British monarchy, as it braces for the end of Elizabeth's nearly 70-year reign and the future accession of Charles. Thanks for tuning in with us this evening. I hope you stick around for Poland Daily Weather, Poland Daily Business, and other programs. But for me, it's have a wonderful evening.